Thank you so much. It was a great start to the conference, and I'm sure there's a hell of a lot more to discuss. I would just like to say before I call Bruce up to give the first keynote, is in terms of research released a couple of weeks ago by Ornico and Worldwide Works, TikTok is now the second biggest social media app in South Africa. It overtook Instagram. It's chasing down Facebook. And I think it's also important to note that out of that research, they found that 40%, well, I think it was just over 40% and it was the second biggest reason for using social media was reading the news. So I just think that's important to keep in mind for our own market, that TikTok is already bigger than Instagram, certainly bigger than Twitter, and is chasing down Facebook. So without any further ado, I would really like to give a warm welcome to Professor Bruce Mutsvairo, who's the Professor and Chair of Media, Politics in the Global South in the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and I invite him to come up and make the keynote. Bruce, welcome.
Thanks, Michael. First of all, I would like to thank Michael for his passion, energy, and honesty, which all have combined to convince all of us that being here today is a just and noble idea. I'm honored to be here, and to Michael and his team of organizers, sponsors, and other stakeholders, many thanks for inviting me. When Michael called me in March and asked me to speak here, I didn't have to think twice. Here's why. As we all know, the journalism fraternity in the Global South, or the majority world, as others prefer to call it, hasn't had an opportunity to sit down together as an entity to discuss, map, critique, and chart the way forward insofar as dealing with deep-seated quagmires associated with the question on whether big tech should pay for the news, and if so, how? Who wouldn't want to be part of this conference today? This issue triggers more questions than answers. Do we need a unified position from the Global South? If so, where do we start? Who should take the lead? Who should be involved? Then we should also think about feasibility questions. Is it even possible to have a shared position given the diverse contexts we all operate in and from? What can we learn from other nations such as Australia, we just had, and Canada, Indonesia? Is it possible to replicate what's being done in Canada and Australia and other countries? I guess we will have some of the answers today or tomorrow during this conference. The issue of context cannot be ignored. The fact that Australia was able to force Google and Meta to pay for news doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a walk in the park for journalism players in non-Western societies. We have been keen to follow suit, but ours is a huge mountain to climb. Many of my colleagues, some of them here, and for example, Anya Schriefling, Courtney Rats, and many others have said loud and clear that big tech needs to foot the bill for the news they consume and profit from, and rightly so. Indeed, most of us here agree. The question is, how do we do it? Here in Africa, for example, long-serving president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, has banned Facebook since 2021. Would Facebook be willing to pay Ugandan publishers for news consumption in a country that they are not even allowed to operate legally from? In what ways does Indonesia's proposal to force big tech to pay for news benefit the rulers, the political elites and the political rulers in Indonesia rather than the news publishers. And of course, we have colleagues from Indonesia, and I saw that on the program, and we'll probably know more after this conference. In Kenya, the case in which Facebook is being sued for unfair dismissal of its content moderators, as we know, highlights the impending problems that will likely befall us if we decide to put Facebook in a corner. In its recent appeal after a judge ruled that Facebook could indeed be sued for unfair dismissal, Mark Zuckerberg's company say they couldn't be liable because they are not even based in Kenya. What happens if Facebook walks away from the global south each time it faces regulatory regimes compelling it to pay for news? Already we know that the tech giant is threatening to pull the plug in Canada and in the US state of California if plans compelling this huge elephant in the room to pay for news becomes law. I don't think Facebook and Google will quit as we agreed with Phaedra de Sante Rome during while we were traveling from the airport last night to the hotel. And she's here. She can confirm that. The tech giant and other players in the industry, in the news industry, or in the tech industry rather, have been portrayed by many scholars and commentators as evil monsters. But can countries in the global south afford to use the same words? A recent Committee to Protect Journalists report concluded that Latin America had been the most dangerous continent for journalists, totaling 30 who were killed in the region in 2022. At the same time, Amnesty International said in its May 2023 report that suppression of press freedom was on the rise in East and Southern Africa. The muscling of media is the order of the day, rather, in many countries in the Arab world and Asia, where, like here in Africa, private and independent media outlets, as we know, are either non-existent or operate under strenuous conditions. Are we therefore asking big tech to pay money that could end up propping up dictators around the world because most of them own the media outlets in their respective countries, using them as platforms for propaganda purposes? And I'm not saying big tech isn't responsible for the outrageous and ubiquitous disinformation and hate speech campaigns that are tormenting many societies around the world. But perhaps we need to think carefully about how we regulate big tech in societies where dissident voices aren't tolerated. And I think there was a colleague who already raised that point during the previous panel. I propose the following, and hopefully this is provocative enough to help us think about how best we can tackle the enormous challenges we face. Number one, we need to accept that the development of digital news is still beyond reach for many journalism players across the across the global south. This is also a point that Courtney points out in her report. A lot needs to be done to ensure that some of the countries in the global south have acceptable infrastructural standards that allow them to launch such regulatory frameworks with ease. Adequately qualified staff to lead such expeditions, and conditions that are free from corrupt tendencies. Funds such as Google's $9.9 million to help Taiwan news providers digitize should be encouraged beyond Asia. Point number two, I would also like to think about who should be paid. Is it just leading news providers who should get the big buck? What about the community journalism providers? What about citizen journalism providers whose content gets shared by platform users sometimes without their consent or awareness? Also, should we, or should who should be involved in these discussions? Rather, is it just media players? So far, particularly here in Africa, I've really missed the voices of the youth. Africa, for example, is home to the world's youngest population. The median age on this continent is 19. They are obviously the future. My work in Ethiopia and Mali has shown that the youths are the main super spreaders of platform-based hate speech and disinformation. Yet they are not getting a seat on the discussion table when these issues are being discussed. What should we do to ensure that multiple voices, including the youth and ordinary people, by the way, have a say? Otherwise, it's going to be seen as another elite talk. I also propose that if we can get them to pay, and we should, then big tech should pay for content, particularly here in the Global South, only in countries where press rights are respected. This could, I argue, tempt countries that jail journalists such as Nicaragua, Ecuador, Venezuela, and many others to reconsider their tough stance against press freedom. This can be done using a multi-stakeholder consensus approach in which an open pool of players could be invited to participate and come up with a payment blueprint. Paying for news should sustain journalism, I argue, as a practice and not just individual entities, because in many countries in the Global South, certainly not all of them, if you pay for news, you are indirectly trumping up dictatorships and propaganda. We have to therefore ask ourselves whether the draft principles for big tech reform should also consider these issues. And more importantly, dialogues and platforms such as these, and thanks, of course, to Michael and his team, they are very good starting points for discussion and finding mutually beneficial solutions. And finally, those countries in the Global South that are doing very well as far as press freedom is concerned, including, for example, Eastern Timor, Samoa, that feature in the top 20, along with top-ranking nations such as Namibia, South Africa, Costa Rica, Trinidad and Tobago, and others. And I'm not saying it's perfect in these countries. As far as the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index 2023 is concerned, I believe should move ahead with attempts to make big tech pay for the news. How? I don't know. Thank you very much.
So I know you've asked a lot of questions, but if anyone wants to ask Bruce a couple of questions to expand, or back there.
Hello, Karim Safiuddin from the Samir Qasir Foundation. Obviously, the Samir Qasir Foundation is extremely invested and interested in the freedom of speech and free rights of journalists to be mobile and express their opinion, and especially in volatile countries like the ones that are in the Middle East or in Lebanon, where we come from. And you mentioned the sensitive role regulation plays on big tech in these contexts, where dissidents usually use big tech to speak freely in a time where media is monopolized and co-opted by authoritarian governments, economic interests, etc., etc. How can we speak, at least discursively, in our context, about being critical on big tech when it is the only space in which journalists can actually tackle important matters, policies, sensitive issues without further repression from their local governments or local big corporate interests per se?
Should I answer? Thanks so much. It's a very tough question. I would actually say that if we look across or around the world, obviously the dominance of these platforms is something that you cannot deny. They are everywhere, as we all know. But I think there's also, an over-reliance on them, or we have also now come to believe that there is no other way to discuss or to have an open dialogue without actually using these platforms. Maybe the question that we should ask is, what did we do before these platforms came? Did we not discuss? I'm sure we were discussing. We were finding ways to speak to each other. I think the problem is we have now sort of accepted that platforms are the only way for us to speak, right? And I think particularly in societies where access to these platforms is restrictive or is not adequately available, perhaps there is need to also think about finding other ways to talk and discuss without really using these platforms. And I think everything is really highly dependent on the context itself, because you could maybe today, if you speak with somebody who is not or who has not been on Facebook or who doesn't even know Facebook, perhaps they have a healthy life, or and maybe they feel very, very lucky about themselves. Because it's not like when we were all joining it, we felt like it was really good for us. And of course, there are good things about being there. But as we are all here, we now also realize that it has really become a problem. So I think we need to be creative and think about our own context, and maybe think about other ways that are not just highly dependent on these networks. Because the more we use them, the more they are going to argue that you need them.
Sorry, me again. I'm really interested in your idea about trying to act as the global South in some kind of collective way. And I was really concerned, on the other hand, about your suggestion that we don't fund the media in countries that are anti-democratic, though that's exactly the media that needs it most. And so I come back, I think, to the fundamental principles that Michael spoke about in his address of the need for independence. And I think that for tackling the funding by big tech of the media in the global South, it has to be international. It has to be not driven by governments and no dependent. It can't go through governments. It shouldn't go to state broadcasters, for example. There's a difference between state and public broadcasters. It shouldn't go to state media. It shouldn't go to political media that is either owned or operated by key political figures. And I think we need to start building some consensus around that. The money should be distributed, I think, by absolutely independent press councils, and where the media itself is having to divvy it up. I know that that's difficult because it's a meeting of competitors. But if governments do this, they will fund their own voices. There's no doubt about that, I think.
Thanks, Justine. I think we've got time for one more question before we've got a break for tea, and we can deal with more afterwards.
Thanks, Bruce. So I think what we're talking about here is sort of, the funding of journalism, and these are supply issues.
Right.
Are there not demand issues? Consumers not wanting to consume as much news? And to what extent can we blame that on the rise of digital platforms? And to what extent can technology be a solution to that demand problem?
Well, I think I completely agree with you, Nick. It's the demand issue. You can't rule it out. And I think when it comes to dealing with the demands, the demand issue, it is, I think, imperative that we actually engage, or we bring it also to this discussion, because of course most of the dominant discussions so far, particularly here in the Global South, have really focused on the supply side of things, and the demand issue is also very important, because of course you also have, as advertisers, they are also big players in this debate, and if we do not bring them into the discussion table, I think we run a risk that this talk or this discussion is only going to focus on the supply side, and then ultimately, in the long term, we are going to run into trouble, into problems.
Just one more question, Nancy. Are you?
Hi, Bruce. This is Nancy Booker from Kenya, Aga Khan University. You talked about context, and going back to what Emma mentioned earlier, that there's need to collectively come together and form groups that can collectively negotiate with big tech companies. So, is there anything that unites the Global South that we can then leverage in negotiating with big tech companies, considering the differentiation that exists? If you look at just the African continent, for example, is there anything that we can leverage that unites us that we can use to negotiate with big tech companies?
I think there's a lot that really unites us. If you think about it, I think Africa as a continent, if nothing is going to be done, particularly to news providers, it's going to worsen the situation, Nancy, if I may, because the problems, range from, the dictatorships I was talking about, but also, we have got plenty of media institutions that cannot even afford to pay their reporters, that cannot even afford to publish, that cannot even afford to move to the digital ecosystems. So if we are going to, if nothing is going to be done, and that's why I also argue that, even though the issue that we are dealing with today is really about whether big tech should pay for the news, I think it's not something that we should just look at it as a unique problem. We should think about Africa as a continent which is multi-layered problems that go beyond the issues that we are dealing with. And those issues and several other factors have a massive effect on how or whether whatever provisions that we come up with would be successful. It's we are talking of poverty, we are talking of access, we are talking of political will, we are talking of many issues that you may think have nothing to do with with news, with the news environment, but they actually have a say. I mean, the research that we are doing that I was referring to is actually showing that, or has proven that disinformation, it can and is exacerbating conflicts in these two countries or in countries in Africa. So that's even dangerous. I think those problems makes us or makes it possible for us to stand together and try to speak from one voice, because the problems are enormous.
Thanks very much, Bruce.